All right. Hello, this is Ellen Mills, and welcome to our Zoom session for Lunch with the Leader. And we're hoping everybody can hear and see as best as possible. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Harry Burgess from Los Alamos County. He is our Los Alamos County manager. And today he is going to be speaking about our budget, which is in process right now in terms of developing the next fiscal year budget. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of information about Mr. Burgess, and then we're going to turn it over to him. You will be able to write in your question and answer at the bottom of your screen. If you take your cursor and put it at the bottom of the screen, you will see a question and answer window where you can type in messages. We're going to let Mr. Burgess do his presentation and then take questions at the end. And we will be winding up at 12:45 today. So first off, Harry Burgess was hired as the Los Alamos County Manager in October 2011. He worked in the governmental sector for over 17 years. His diverse educational background includes a bachelor's degree in industrial relations with an emphasis on personnel organization management. Mr. Burgess holds a master's degree in fire and emergency management administration, an MBA, Master of Business Administration, and a doctoral degree in economic development. Certainly extremely qualified. So welcome, Mr. Burgess. You can go ahead and start.
Well, great. Thank you. And thank you for everybody for being here today. I've got a couple of different slides I'd like to show here in a second, but just wanted to provide a little background beforehand. And we just began, the county did its budget hearings last evening. We have them scheduled again to pick up tonight, and then if necessary, Monday and Tuesday evenings of next week. Some of you may have tuned in for that presentation as we stream and broadcast the hearings also, not only on the internet, but on PAC 8. So hopefully some folks had chances to see that. We do spend a lot of time preparing our budget, and the hearings are only the tail end of that process. So we began back in month of December, as we do most every year, to get our departments together to begin preparing our budgets. Typically around that time, I provide guidance to the departments for their budget development. And that guidance was provided again back in December, primarily focusing on the two different issues. First was for the departments to develop their budget consistent with what they currently had in place. And as we go year to year, the council may approve certain one-time expenditures to buy a particular piece of equipment or to execute a specific project. And so what I asked of all our departments in this year's budget development was that they remove all those one-time approvals and instead just leave us with a base budget. That base budget would be enough essentially to keep the lights on, to continue the operations as each department performs them on an annual basis, so that maintains the number of personnel. Each specific program that was already enacted would continue, and then provides for the monies necessary to do a variety of things, from addressing health insurance increases. Our annual salary plan includes an opportunity for folks to get raises based on performance, so that was to be included in their budgets. And then any contractual issues, such as with an outside agency that performs or provides a certain level of services. Sometimes those are multi-year contracts and may have annual increases. So we wanted to go ahead and plug those into that same base budget so that when we went before council, we would have a basis for operations moving forward. And then any increases or additions to what we're performing at present would be the subject of council deliberations. And then they could ask questions about those expansion type programs. We term those to be budget options. And so our budget presentation consists of the base budget and then those budget options. Obviously for this year, the COVID emergency has caused us all to operate a little bit differently. And you may have already seen the council is now solely broadcasting their council meetings instead of having the in-person attendance available. Instead, everyone must attend via an online format. And that does make things a little bit more difficult in our daily operations, but also obviously in conducting these meetings. So we did adopt the same format for our budget hearings this year. So last night, although we were broadcasting from the municipal building, everyone attending the meeting was situated at their homes and, in fact, participating via Zoom as we are today, but then we rebroadcast that Zoom conversation over our normal channels so that the public could see it as well. Given that we began our budgeting process back in December, we obviously started the planning and preparation and the numbers before we ever knew the words COVID-19. And so some of our preparations were towards a little bit different expectation than we have today. Because of that, forgive me if the sun's messing with us, we did provide an initial budget proposal, and we published that proposal at the end of March. We published a summary and had that sent out to all the households in the county. That particular presentation did not consider the COVID changes that may be introduced. Because it takes so long to put this together, we did not restart our process once we changed operations for this response. But we did provide some updates to council last night, specifically in terms of how this emergency may affect both our expense side and our response needs, as well as in our revenue side, which obviously with certain businesses closing or not serving the public right now, that potential for revenue generation in the form of taxes is not occurring. And so we had to obviously consider what changes that would introduce for our budget for next year as well. I'll just, at a very high level, the county budget covers all of our operations. However, it's divided into a general fund, which is the biggest portion of our discretionary expenses. Most general taxes go towards that general fund. We also have a public utilities division, which has its own separate budget and is funded solely by revenues from their operations. And so as opposed to taxes, which fund the general fund operations, our revenues for public works come from the monthly bills for utilities. I said public works, I should have said utilities, excuse me. Our revenues for utilities come from the utility bills that are sent out monthly. And so it is operated as what is known as an enterprise fund, more of a business-like operation as opposed to one funded by taxes. We also have a number of smaller funds that have various sources of revenue. Typically, they are outside of the county grants that we may receive from the state or federal government, or other enterprise-related services such as our solid waste function, which is not part of our utility department. They each have their own separate budget, and we track their revenue sources, depending on what they may be, versus their expenditures separately from our general fund. Now, typically during our budget conversations, we focus on the general fund. And in fact, all last evening was focused on general fund. We have some more follow-up conversation this evening. And then once we conclude the general fund, the council will then entertain the proposed utilities budget and go through the same process for them, as well as for each of those individual sub-funds I mentioned. But the smaller funds don't take that much time compared to the general fund and our utilities budget. So just a little background, obviously we're operating in some austere times with the COVID emergency. So the county itself has, as everyone knows, largely reduced its operations. We have sent personnel home to either telecommute or in some cases, we've placed them on emergency paid leave, which means that they have to stay aware of following emails and be available for callback as needed. And then we have certain personnel, such as you'll see myself here today. I'm in the office because of necessary needs for signatures and the like, direction, but also given the county services, we have a number of operations that are still fully functional. And that's everything from our obvious law enforcement, our fire and EMS operations, our utilities, our solid waste collection and the eco station itself, as well as a number of our parks and recreation personnel who need to maintain the existing parks and some of our infrastructure so that when we do reopen, it remains functional. Obviously, everything needs to be maintained even when it's not being used on a daily basis. And so we still do have quite a contingent of individuals that are actively coming to work, physically coming to work on any given day and providing a certain level of services. Even in this municipal building today, we are operating a number of our offices so that people can continue. For example, construction activity was deemed to be an essential service. In order to do new construction, people must be able to obtain permits and the necessary follow-up inspections to get their project completed. And so we've got personnel in this building, our building inspector office, who still are here to respond to people's needs, interact as necessary, and actually go out into the field to perform their inspections. So the county's in a little bit different situation. We haven't closed our doors completely, but we certainly have sent as many people home to either telecommute or to just simply be available for future needs, as many as possible in order to be responsive to the governor's directives. That kind of translates into our revenues, because obviously the county is based on a couple of different revenues, and I'm going to try to share my screen here and illustrate a couple of different things. So let me find the right. I will start by just showing these are pages from our budget book, and it is a couple inch thick book that is provided to council to illustrate our budget. These documents are available online at the county's website. They're available in the lobby of the municipal building for individuals who may want to come in and view a hard copy of it. And also they were attached to the agenda for the meeting that we conducted last night and will be conducting tonight and in subsequent evenings if necessary. In front of us on the screen is a breakdown of our revenues. As you can see, the largest portion of those revenues is from gross receipts taxes. Those are typically termed sales taxes. And for the county, typically counties are more dependent on property taxes, whereas cities are more dependent on gross receipts taxes, at least in this state. However, as an incorporated county, we rely on both. We have authorities to tax both gross receipts and property. And because of that, we have a somewhat unique perspective when we look at our revenues, because most counties would have an inverse showing the majority of their revenue coming from property taxes and very little bit coming from gross receipts taxes, as they are typically businesses that operate within city limits and would normally be taxed by municipalities. Excuse me. So just as a general overview, the majority of our revenue comes from gross receipts taxes. About 95% of the gross receipts taxes collected come from Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so that is a consideration when we're looking to develop our budget for next year. As you've seen probably in the news, many municipalities are concerned about their revenue source. Businesses are closed. They are not operating right now, and therefore the cities are receiving less revenue. In fact, I believe the headlines in the New Mexican this morning was that Santa Fe is estimating a $46 million loss to their budget. Well, the laboratory is still operating today. They have, we're seeing fewer people transit between their homes and the lab itself, but as I understand, 77% of their personnel are now working from home, and the remainder do have to come into the laboratory to do certain mission critical or security critical work that they cannot perform from their house. However, they're fully operational despite the fact that many people are working from home. And what that means is that the contractor, Triad National Security, is still performing their contract. And when they are paid by the federal government, that generates gross receipts taxes for our community. And that is what the county represents here in its revenue projections. So although we do have a lot of restaurants and retail operations are closed right now. That is a small portion of our overall revenue collection. And to date, our conversations with the laboratory are that they intend to continue in the same operational structure. And we do not anticipate a significant reduction in our overall tax revenue because of that fact, because they constitute 95% of our normal collections of gross receipts taxes. If you look at the other items on this list, you'll see property taxes are 10% of our revenue. Obviously, there has not been a change to those projections. The rates and the amounts that people are owed are set on an annual basis, and the COVID emergency has not, we don't anticipate a reduction in that due to this crisis. Excuse me. And then interdepartmental charges, we charge one another for various needs. Our legal team, for example, provides services to our utilities department, and we must charge between the two in order to stay consistent with our charter, which mandates that the charges to the customers of the utility department represent all the charges. And so we do charge between departments for various services that cross between the general fund and our utility department or some other funds. Just as a highlight for our overall budget, I'm going to go down a couple pages here, and I'm going to show you our general fund budget summary. And I'm sorry, but it's a little small. I'll see if I can blow it up here. Yes. And this top portion of the document, let's see, I should have I'm going to get a little pointer here if I can. I'm afraid I can't figure that out right now, but this arrow shows. So we begin with our fund balance. We have certain revenues. You can see our gross receipts taxes for this general fund are listed here, property taxes and the like from the prior slide. And then this lower section here shows our expenditures that come out of the general fund. As I mentioned, this was the discretionary portion of the county's budget. And overall, we are looking at, for our proposed budget for fiscal year 21, is this column here. To the left are prior years, and to the right is the second year of our budget. We do project out for the following year as well. For this particular year, you'll see that our revenues we're projecting, despite the COVID emergency, to still have a greater than 3% increase in this number. And that is after we've taken into account all the potential impacts of the COVID crisis. And then for that base budget I discussed earlier, this represents that base budget. You will see compared to the prior year, this is being the variance column, that some of the numbers are slightly higher, some of them are significantly lower as we took out those one-time expenditures from last year's operations. So that overall, we have a proposed budget for the general fund expenditures of $61,523,000. That number, as you look over to this column here that represents the variance, is 0.6% increase over last year's number, that being this column here of 61,128,000. And so our proposed base budget is only slightly larger than last year's. Now, that in saying that, it's for the general fund only, because we did receive some comments last night and some concerns when individuals looked at the overall budget we had published. They recognized that our proposed budget total for next year is about $26 million higher than this present year. And there was concern about how that works in the current crisis. How can we plan to spend more given that we know these businesses are closed? As I mentioned earlier, obviously the laboratory is a big influence there. So we felt like that was a significant part of our budget and was not going away. At the same time, that $26 million difference, we're going to spend $26 million more next year than this year, is primarily due to a planned project within our utilities department. And the county's Department of Public Utilities, as has been in the news lately, has been looking to replace the White Rock wastewater treatment plant. And to do so, it's an approximate $21 million project that has to be budgeted in this next year. It is not, as many were concerned, just obvious extra spending for next year. We've been planning this for many years. We've now gotten a couple of grants lined up. We have funded the project itself. And in order to actually move forward with it, we must put that funding into our budget. And so overall, the county's budget did grow by some $26 million. However, when we look just at our general fund, which is typically the services you'll see here on the list of the departments that people expect from the county, everything from our community services department, which has our parks and rec, our fire, our police, public works, including all our streets and traffic, transit, my office, the manager's office, the attorney's office, our court, sheriff and county council, as well as our elected offices, all operate out of this general fund. And for our base budget, we did have just that slight increase. I say that because there is a second part to our overall budget that once we've presented our base budget, we then go back to council and ask them for changes, any increases, and these would be those new programs I discussed earlier. This first page illustrates the total impact of these various proposals, but before I spend too much time on it, I just want to scroll through. We did provide to council, I believe it's a total of 65 what we call budget options. And they are a number of different things that have come up operationally needed or specific requests from the community or from council for different programs. And I recognize that it's probably hard to read any of these in any depth, but this is attached to our budget presentation online for our meetings. And so if you'd like to get into there and look at the specifics, you're welcome to do so. I did take all of the requests that I received from the various departments and ranked them either as an A, a B, a C, or a D, just to give a first pass at these various projects. So council has an idea of my perspective of the importance of the individual requests pursuant to our obligations to provide services to the community. So if I chose, go down here and look at a particular request, this got a C ranking, so it's not a highest priority. This number is just a reference number, but for our human resources department, this is a request for an additional FTE or a full-time equivalent, which means an additional person. In this case, we're asking for an additional person within our risk department to address the needs that we see within that department to handle just day-to-day operations and make sure that our employees operate in a safe manner, to follow up on all claims that may be generated, as well as maintaining our insurance policies that cover those various liabilities. So this particular request would go in front of council. They would consider the amount that is listed here and then ultimately vote as to whether or not to add this item to our budget. And like I mentioned, there's 65 of these. Last evening, we were able to get through the base budget. Council did tentatively approve that budget. And then we began to go through these options. We made it through all of the A's, and they approved all but 2 of the A items. And so when they approve them, we then go back to this first page I was showing you, and it shows the various costs that we're talking about. So this table here, for all the A items, A ranked items, it shows the amounts that are included under that by individual fund. For example, here the general fund would hold 260,000 of that. Our capital improvement fund, CIP, has over $4 million of requests. And then our emergency declarations, this is related to the COVID emergency, has $500,000 there. All of them were designated as highest priority. And if approved, the council adds $4.9 million to our budget. Similarly, for item A for FTEs, you go down to the bottom here, the A's included 6.5 positions, new positions, and those costs were all contained within the general fund. All those new positions would be in the general fund. It may be different for the C ranking. There were some positions in other funds, for example. Some of our costs are one-time. That might be buying a car, or recurring. That might be paying an insurance or a contractual cost. And so we do split those up so that council knows whether they're approving a one-time expense or a recurring expense. Obviously, the recurring expense has further implications for future years. So we do try to provide that information to council so that they can make an informed decision. As they make their decisions, this particular page you see in front of you is live, so that if they delete a certain item or approve an item, it automatically collates that information and provides them with a running total of the amount of the budget options that they have approved, so that they can make sure that they don't go over the available amount of money that is available. I'll go back to this page because I think it's important to see here. This is the general fund budget summary, and many people focus on our general fund as it is our discretionary spending. And it's important to note, as we're talking about, are we able to go forward with a good budget as proposed, despite the situations we find ourselves in now? And I want to focus on what the county does. Now, most counties are required to have what is known as a 3/12 reserve. And that is due to the fact they have to have 3/12 of any given year's revenue on hand, because most counties are operated by property taxes, which come in twice a year. And so they don't want counties to operate with a smaller amount of money, because their reserves would not be enough to maybe carry them through between the months of May and November, when the first property tax payments come in and when the next property tax payments come in. Conversely, municipalities, which the county also operates as, are required to have a 1/12 reserve, a smaller reserve, because they get gross receipts taxes every month. They get a distribution. And so they have a more consistent revenue stream and don't need as many reserves. Now, the county has taken an extra step. Beyond those state required reserves, we have our own financial policy that requires us to also set aside an additional 20% of our annual revenue for long-term reserves. That 20% shows up here in this line. Unassigned is what it's called, target, 20% of revenue. So pursuant to our own financial policies, we have a 20% more than the state requires in reserve. And for the budget year in question, the one that we're proposing, that amounts to $14.8 million that the county has in reserve over and above those state requirements. Now, if you look at this line item here that says unassigned, it is broken down in this green area to two separate portions. Unassigned with that 20%, and then the unassigned over that same target. So if you look at this number in the unassigned line item, it's $28,898,000. Look down here, you take the 14.8 away from that total unassigned balance, that being the 20%, we have a remainder of over $14 million of what some may term as being surplus, or additional reserves as we have it. That is the number that council really has to play with when they're considering those various budget options. And so they don't have to spend all that money, but they do know that they have that much available, and they have to consider whether it's a one-time cost, which would only hit this bottom line, or a recurring cost, which would also add to subsequent years' expenditures. So we are healthy in that we have additional reserves per our own policies, but then that we also have almost the same additional amount of unassigned reserves beyond our stipulated 20% amount in addition to those state requirements. So we do have a very healthy budget that allows us to provide a high level of service to our community. And it's through years of conservative practices that we were able to build up and even maintain that budget. Because you can see in prior years, we've had over, this first year was low. If you recall, we went through some, we had some rec expenses that drew down that balance, but we've built it back up to over $10 million each subsequent year to where we're at 14 now. I will mention that the process we go through, obviously we have to submit our budget to the state, who has oversight. We have to do that by June 1st. That's why we're in the process of developing our budget right now. However, we also submit our budget to an organization known as the Government Finance Officers Association. And they review budgets based on their own criteria. And the county has received an award from that organization for our budget presentation for each of the past consecutive 27 years. And so we've had a long-standing operation where we illustrate our budget in good terms. Otherwise, they would not award us with this annual award. And also it meets the criteria that they promote that should be included in public budgeting so that the public can clearly understand what we're doing, where the money is, and where it's going. So with that, I know that we talked about having some potential questions. I don't know, Ellen, are we ready for that at this point? I want to make sure to allow enough time. I could go on and on about this, but I'd be showing a lot more numbers on screens, and I'm not sure what individuals' focus may be.
So we do have a few questions that have already been submitted. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is actually about the COVID, which of course is on everybody's mind at this point. So our first question is from Rebecca Chaikin, and she says, most of the Smiths employees are not wearing masks. Is there anything that can be done about that? And I know that that's a private business, but they are very much a part of our community.
Correct. There is things we can do. Not all of them are necessarily authoritarian or forceful, I guess is the best way to answer that. This particular emergency has given its flavor. It's obviously a worldwide issue. In our state, the Department of Health has taken primary operational leadership in this response because they're coordinating medical resources beyond Los Alamos County borders. Mm-hmm. And so the directives you've seen have been coming from the governor, not from the county council, as far as restrictions on businesses that operate and other regulations as they, the stay-at-home order, those types of things have all come from the governor's level. We do not, in our charter locally, have the authority to do certain things that the governor does. And that's just due to the powers that have been entrusted to that office versus the local county council. Mm-hmm. So we do not have the authority to initiate martial law, for example. That was not considered in our charter, and we did not give our own elected officials the authority to do those types of actions. And so we've been following and supporting the state's directives to date, encouraging where it can, especially with my own employees. I've encouraged the use of face masks. I did have a difficulty in that you cannot just go down to the store and buy one. Obviously, they ran out of supply months ago now. And so we had to go through a process where we actually ordered from both businesses and also arranged with local sewing groups to provide our employees with these masks. And so we couldn't really mandate them until we had them, and we're still in the process of collecting them, but we're encouraging our employees to wear them whenever they are interacting with the public, and specifically when they cannot maintain that 6-foot distancing that has been recommended. If you look at the governor's order, it similarly did not mandate the wearing of face masks, but recommended them. It used the word voluntary in the directive itself. And so we don't have the authority to go into a business or to talk to someone walking down the street to enforce a governor's directive that doesn't exist. There is no mandatory wearing of face masks. All that being said, we have had county councilors reach out to the management at Smiths. In fact, one of our counselors showed an interest initially, and he reached out himself. He has maintained communications with them. It was through this interaction that we originally got the senior hours noted at Smiths, where I believe it's 3 days a week for the first hour or two of their operations. They're only allowing people in over a certain age. We've also been following up with them and other businesses to encourage and promote the use of face masks. I know that the council has had conversations with Smiths identifying the fact that people are concerned by this. and encouraging them to provide them with masks so that they can wear them and direct them to do so. We cannot, but the employer could direct their own employees to wear such. So that communication's going on, but it's somewhat of a it's more in the encouragement ability as opposed to sending the police in and asking them to do it very directly. We don't have that authority, and so we've tried to walk that line. That being said, as I mentioned, we are having conversations encouraging them to not only provide face masks, but also the plexiglass and other things that we've seen around those businesses.
Okay, and just to confirm, the county council meetings will be recorded until further notice and accessed through online options.
They are both broadcast live at the time, and they've always been recorded, and you can look at any past county council meeting via our website. We have links to those recordings.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question from David North. It looks like you cut your own office budget. Does that present any difficulties or loss of capability?
Well, that's a good question, because you do see some decreases here. And as I mentioned, some of those adjustments were for one-time expenditures, so that once we performed those, we did not have the need for that recurring use of monies. Instead, we wanted to add it back to that bottom line so that council could consider newer programs. So in many of those, in all of those situations where you see negatives, and that would be in this column here, we are not reducing services. This is, again, our base budget to perform the same level of service as we did last year. It also accommodates all the various anticipated contractual and policy-related increases. So we have a fully functional budget. This does not cause me any concern because those were one-time expenses that did not recur, will not recur for the next fiscal year. Excuse me. And then you can see that it varied between departments. Mine is not the biggest reduction, as you'll see in some of these others. There were more specific projects in other of our departments. However, some did have needs for increases just to make the base budget intact. So overall, we are not reducing any services by the numbers you see here. We are proposing that we can conduct the same level of service that we did in the present year for next year with a 0.6% increase in total costs.
Okay, so I just received another question from Amy Birnbaum. The construction crews working on the roundabout are also not wearing masks most of the time, including both STAR employees and county employees. Are you aware, and have you tried to get them to comply?
Well, I'm not specifically aware of the STAR employees, I will admit. They are a contractor to the state, and the state, I know, has been in communication with all of their contractors to try to facilitate that, obviously being a state directed order. I'm not certain which county employees would necessarily be working out at the roundabout at present. If anyone, it is our Department of Public Utilities. And as I mentioned before, we're trying to obtain masks for everyone so that we can direct them to use them. But until that time, we've asked them to operate based on the social distancing norms. And whenever they can obtain a mask, to use it in those situations. So internally, we're definitely having those conversations, but I can certainly follow up with the state as they are the ones to direct their employees or contractors on the site. That I'll mention happily that the 502 project is a state-led project.
Okay, thanks. I know we've done a really very good job in Los Alamos County with keeping our infection rate down based on the data we have. So of course, people are concerned about doing everything we can to keep that as low as possible. I have a question now from Leslie Wallstrom. Many of us are concerned about the lab's mandate to produce plutonium pits here in Los Alamos. What influence do you have to ensure that this decision is carefully considered by the lab, since so many parties affected live right here and enjoy the safe, natural beauty of this town? Do you meet with Tom Mason or his staff and discuss huge decision changes like this?
That's It's a good question. With respect to laboratory policy, that is not an area that I have influence. I'm not in that group. We do, however, meet with lab management regularly. I don't meet with Director Mason. I meet with the federal representatives, Mike Weiss from the NNSA, who is the site manager, and Thomas Johnson, who is the environmental management sides manager as well. So those are both federal employees. Mr. Mason is a contractor to the federal government. They work obviously at their direction. However, our council chair does interact with Mr. Mason on a regular basis to keep those lines of communication open. We also do travel to Washington, D.C. multiple times a year to promote county and community interests. Usually when we get involved in situations, they are areas of mutual interest that we're trying to promote. We have not entered into a situation where we're trying to direct the mission of the laboratory, as that is not what we're elected or employed to do necessarily. However, when it comes down to community safety, we do promote those types of issues, and it's come into effect with cleanup. It's come into play with traffic situations. It certainly is an issue with the housing considerations right now. And obviously the whole community has been formerly lab property at one time, and much of that property is transferred to us to then put into use for housing or business or other purposes. So we do interact from the point of view of trying to promote a safe and healthy community. We have lobbied quite a bit for cleanup activity monies and have been successful in doing so. And then when specific issues arise, such as the discovery of certain materials on DP Road that occurred back in February, we interact with them to ensure the safety of our community as we try to mitigate those issues. So that includes everything from responses to responders to having the right trained personnel on site to be able to determine whether or not there is a hazard. And then as certain, in this case, excavation occurs, to ensure that that hazard does not become mobile, either airborne or somehow transferred to some other location. So I guess the answer is a bit of yes and a bit of no, but it's focused on those points of specific interaction where we have mutual interests, as opposed to trying to direct laboratory operations. I will say that the county council did pass a resolution supporting the pit production mission. And that was obviously interest in the economic influence of having additional people and mission here, as opposed to seeing that mission go elsewhere. That was, I believe, 2 years ago that the council did approve such a resolution. So they have expressed support for the mission, while also promoting that it's done safely and that none of those activities negatively affect the people living here.
Okay, thank you. So we now have a question from Jody Benson. First, thank the county employees for the work they do to make Los Alamos such an exceptional place to live. And second, is the proposed budget based on the projected $13.2 billion that the federal government had mandated for LANL upgrades? With the COVID, it is probable that the federal funding will be withdrawn. Does this affect the budget, or is the budget based on normal years?
There is no normal year in
right.
Got it. Anywhere for that matter, I should say. Things change, and obviously this is not a normal year. However, we base our budget on, obviously the federal budget is a big part of that consideration. In prior years, as well as this year, we always make a point of discussing directly with the laboratory, procurement, and finance departments what their spend is going to be, because it does not matter what the budget is. What matters is what they spend, because there might be a given year that, like this, for whatever reason, they don't get to fully expend the amount, or in certain times when we've had continuing resolutions at the federal level, they reduce the amount of money that can be spent by the federal government at the laboratory. So we have to be responsive to those influences. We have been in communication with the laboratory as we prepared this budget They project for us their spend. It's part of their job that they do anyway to advise their personnel on when they can make purchases and when certain projects begin and end. So we did base the budget on our budget on their overall budget. Now, I'm not familiar with the $13 billion number. The one I'm more familiar with is in the 2.7 to 2.8 range on an annual basis. However, it's not just about that annual budget, it's also about their construction budget, because those types of projects do add to the expenditures and obviously the revenue generation as well. We typically meet with laboratory personnel in the December to February timeframe to get an idea of their expected spend over the next fiscal year. We did that again this year. We asked some very directed questions about how the situation was going to change, and we followed up with them in March after the various closures occurred to see if there had been any change between their anticipated spend before COVID and after. And because they're still operational, because they have not laid off anyone and they have not stopped any of their projects, they're still projecting a similar spend over the next fiscal year, which would support our original numbers that we proposed. Now, obviously, certain restaurants and many retail establishments are closed. They are a smaller portion of our budget, but just to be conservative, we reduced our numbers. Although our analysis showed that we didn't need to, we did reduce our overall numbers by $1.5 million of revenue for each of 21 and the 22 proposed budgets. And so we started with a conservative budget. We have reduced each of those by $1.5 million to date. And then if you'll look at that's just off the top. We've also, if anybody's checked their 401k or similar type of account lately, they know we went through a great decrease in that valuation since COVID. Not only did we reduce the overall expected GRT revenue, but in our various investment income lines throughout the budget, we have zeroed those out because we do not anticipate getting any revenue from our investments over the next fiscal year. That being said, yes, we have tried to accommodate the information that we have today. We believe that the budget is still very conservative in its presentation. And we recognize that we are different than many of our other communities that are suffering from such a loss of retail businesses. We're not anticipating the same type of effects on our community as we're reading about in the papers that are affecting other communities.
Okay. Our next question is from Maura O'Neill. Very few people have been tested for COVID-19 in Los Alamos County to date. Is the county working on getting any more testing events scheduled similar to the one that was held at Overlook Park?
Yes, well, we did originally hold that one at Overlook Park. And at the time that they came up, the Department of Health also tested everyone who lived at the Beehive community down in White Rock because it was fairly close to that location. On that day, we were talking to the individual in charge of these various pop-up testing sites, and he indicated that the state was first trying to get around to the majority of the communities to do these just one-day tests to address that need, but that then they would be recirculating in order to come back and do additional testing later. They also wanted to come back specifically to test our other retirement homes in the community. Mm-hmm. Since that time, and they indicated they would, since that time, they have also stood up a regular testing site, and this just came out, I'm sure Mara's aware. I believe they started last week on Wednesday. So every Monday and Wednesday for a couple of hours in the morning on each day, at our Department of Health, Public Health office here in town in Los Alamos, they are conducting by appointment these same testing sites, and I anticipate that that's going to be their answer for the near future until we get to a point where they're doing more specific, more broad-based testing to work on kind of reopening type plans. I know there's been conversations about how testing will drive that, and we're talking about both the existing testing as well as the antibody testing that may be useful in determining if people have had it and are no longer susceptible. So we're still working with the state to try to get those types of tests available. I don't have a good prognosis on when that'll be available, even in the state of New Mexico at this time.
Mhm.
But we have had the new, again, and we have a continuous, it's no longer a one-time testing. Every Monday and Wednesday for the foreseeable future, there will be testing going on at our public health office.
Okay, so we're getting down to probably our last two questions in this session today. And the next one is from Amy Birnbaum. Has the COVID virus impacted any of the construction projects that were planned or are ongoing now?
Very limited, and I can speak specifically to county projects and ones that we are involved with. There are a number of developers here in town that obviously we interact with for permitting, some of which we assisted with the either sale or donation of land for various projects. Excuse me. So none of those projects to date have actually been withdrawn. In fact, many of them are continuing. I think if you look around town, you will see that the school's field house is still being constructed. The natural grocers next door to the former McDonald's is started to come out of the ground. Down on DP Road, we have an affordable housing project that is under construction right now. And the county has continued to do its support services, trying to put in infrastructure for each of these developments as well. So surprisingly, I have not seen any noticeable reduction in the projects that are continuing. And in our community development department, we continue to have people pulling permits and inquiring about various development projects. Everything seems to be going forward. We're just doing it from a distance, except for the on-site construction work. So far, no, I have not seen any market reduction and have not heard of any similar types of reductions on the laboratory side either. They seem to be moving forward with their own construction projects as well.
Okay, and then we have a question from David North. Have you any news about the possibility of reduced spending by the federal government on cleanup in Los Alamos County?
Yes, I do. Well, and I refer to that as the county council and myself travel to DC to effectively lobby for cleanup funds year to year. We've been successful over the past 3 years of getting what's known as a plus up to the budget. As the proposed budget, this comes from the president, had come out in the $185, $186 million range for local cleanup efforts. Through the council's discussion, we were able to increase those amounts to $220 million for each of the past 3 years. Interestingly, this year, the president's budget proposal was to cut that $220 million standard, as we've established, to $120 million, almost in half. We have a lot of concern about that. We did not go to DC physically this year, but we did visit with all the same individuals we normally visit with via teleconference, as we're doing similar to what we're doing today, and expressed our concern. We do have, in fact, tomorrow, the last of those meetings with environmental management. However, this is the president's proposed budget, and it goes through a process now where Congress considers that budget and potentially makes changes to it. This year, it being an election year, it's questionable whether there'll be any budget ultimately approved, as the election cycle typically prevents that from happening. No one wants to take a stance. And you often find that we're in a continuing resolution, and that is just a budget based on the prior year's budget until we get through the election cycle. So yes, we're concerned. Yes, we've had conversations about it, but to date, we have not seen that congressional side of the process do its churn to come out with a different proposal or a counter proposal to that presidential number. In either case, the higher likelihood, I believe, is that we will end up in a continuing resolution, which will be some percentage of that original $220 million, which will be much better than the proposed budget as it exists today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking time out of a very, very busy schedule for you And so we really appreciate all that information you provided and quite a variety of questions that we had today, but you
Well,
were,
this is a budget meeting, I thought.
yeah, exactly. So we appreciate your time, and we're winding it up right now. I do want to say to those members who are listening, you will need to leave this meeting and then sign in to our next annual meeting as a separate meeting, and you should have an email on that. And thank you very much for your presentation today.
Oh, you're certainly welcome. Thanks for the time. I
Okay.
appreciate sharing that info. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.